sit down. The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. I would like to first express my condolences to the Bush family in remembrance of First Lady Barbara Bush, who served this country so well. Really the matriarch of a dynasty family that we all admire. I'll never forget President Bush and Barbara actually endorsing me in my first primary, and it was quite an endorsement to have. She had a great strength about her and a great sense of humor, I think, all the way until the end. And I will be in Houston on Friday at the ceremony in remembrance. And if we could just take a moment of silence. So the committee is meeting today to examine information sharing and cooperation between federal, state, and local partners, the responses to the Boston Marathon bombings, and the recent series of bombings in my hometown of Austin, Texas. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. 5 years ago, as thousands of people were running towards the finish line in Boston, 2 bombs exploded. In a matter of seconds, a time of celebration became a time of terror. In the midst of the chaos on this Patriots' Day afternoon, ordinary citizens, first responders, and members of the National Guard worked frenetically to save lives. Our nation was stunned. This hateful attack killed 3 innocent people at the scene, including an 8-year-old boy. Of the 260 people who were injured, 16 of them lost their limbs. MIT police officers later shot and killed as the bombers tried to avoid capture. Many people's lives were changed forever. After a strong response from the FBI, the Massachusetts State Police, ATF, and local police, both of the bombers were brought to justice. One was killed in a shootout, and the other sits on death row. When it became clear that one of the bombers had been on our radar screen before the attacks, this committee took action. After an extensive investigation, we learned there were opportunities where additional steps could have been taken. Even though we will never know if things might have turned out differently, this committee's report made several key recommendations to bolster information sharing and strengthen partnerships among federal, state, and local law enforcement. More than anything else, the committee's investigation led to a stronger Homeland Security bond between federal, state, and local. We're always working to formalize and improve information sharing between agencies. And though much more work needs to be done, at least 5 of the committee's 7 recommendations have been addressed. Here are some examples. The FBI revised its Memorandum of Understanding with agencies partnering on its joint terrorism task forces to more clearly encourage information sharing. Second, the FBI normalized communication between JTTFs and partner agencies. Third, DHS improved their travel record keeping. And finally, broad investments have been made to inform the public on the threat we face from terrorism and enlist their help in combating it. And these changes were necessary. They've made a real impact over time and have remained at the heart of this committee's initiatives. And after 5 years, our counterterrorism partnerships are improved, and the coordination among federal, state, and local law enforcement, I believe, is stronger. We witnessed this just last month when my hometown of Austin was terrorized by a bomber. In response, Austin Chief Brian Manley, who is here today, commanded local and state law enforcement personnel with over 500 federal agents deployed to assist in the operations. This represented the largest mobilization of law enforcement since the bombings in Boston. Working together, they were able to track down the bomber and stop him in his tracks and stop these attacks. Unfortunately, the bomber had already murdered 2 people and injured 6 others. I've spoken to several of the victims and their family members. It was very painful to hear their voices and stories, but inspiring to learn of their strength. And Chief Manley, I was very impressed by the way you led our hometown through such a difficult time. You were determined in bringing the bomber to his final justice. And on behalf of the Austin community and as a resident of Austin, Texas, we are grateful you brought this nightmare to an end. And now is the time to heal. I know that FBI officials in the area worked hard to support your investigation, including the special agent in charge at the San Antonio field office, Chris Combs, who I was in very constant contact with, and the resident agent in Austin, John Scata. The tragedies in Boston and Austin are very different, but they reflect the continued progress we as a country are making towards Homeland security. And at the heart of each are basic questions of coordination, sharing, and mutual support. We must continue to learn from these tragedies so we can prevent the next one. As a former federal prosecutor, I understand this requires flawless coordination at all levels. This committee has achieved a lot, but we are always looking to do more. That's why this hearing today is so important to me. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. Each of you provide an important voice on this issue. But you also represent many brave men and women who spring to action and spring to valor during a time of emergency. You and they work hard to protect American families every day, and we thank you for that. And this entire committee is thankful for your service. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, the acting ranking member, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for her statement.
Thank you, Mr. McCall, and I want to associate myself with the condolences that you extended to the Bush family. You couldn't help but notice that this is a strong family values woman. Her grandchildren love being around her. Her sons who were in politics never were remiss in not mentioning her and the importance that she had in their lives. And of course, her husband, former President Bush, spoke of her dearly. So we are better that she lived among us and cared about those who needed someone to reach out to them, including HIV babies and young people. And we pray God's blessings upon her family and upon her soul. On behalf of Ranking Member Thompson, I thank Chairman McCall for holding today's hearing on Homeland death threat information sharing in the wake of the Austin bombings and just after the 5th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing. I join my colleagues in remembering those who lost their lives in these tragic attacks, and in keeping their families, friends, and loved ones in our prayers. Ranking Member Thompson wrote to Chairman McCall last month requesting a hearing on the events in Austin. He did so because it is imperative that we examine attacks on the homeland closely, no matter the ideology or the motivation driving them, to better identify and to disrupt future attacks. Information sharing failures that contributed to 9/11 terrorist attacks are well documented. Since that time, the federal government has made enormous strides in addressing these failures, not only by improving information sharing among its own departments and agencies, but also with state and local partners. These state and local law enforcement agencies are in many ways our ears, our eyes, and our boots on the ground in our communities. As such, they are an essential part of our Homeland Security information sharing apparatus, participating in fusion centers and joint terrorism task forces across the country, as well as in more informal information sharing mechanisms with law enforcement counterparts on an everyday basis. That said, we know there is always room for continued improvement. Shortly after the Boston bombing, it is my understanding that a directive was sent from FBI headquarters to the field intended to ensure better information sharing with federal, state, and local law enforcement. I am therefore interested in understanding the effects of that directive and whether the police chiefs in Boston, Austin, and Washington, D.C. believe it is being implemented still today. I hope they will also share their thoughts on how we can take the lessons learned not just from 9/11 or Boston, but also the recent events in Austin, Parkland, and Sutherland Springs, and use them to redouble our information sharing efforts to better secure the homeland. For the federal witnesses, I hope they will speak to their commitment to information sharing, not just in generalities, but with concrete examples about how the FBI and the ATF can improve information sharing and better assess the effectiveness of our existing initiatives. Finally, I would be remiss if I did not point out the importance of Homeland Security grants, like the UASI, to local communities, their ability to prevent and respond to the kinds of attacks we saw in Boston and in Austin. Without these dollars, many cities and towns lack the resources to provide the equipment and the training necessary to respond effectively. I've been greatly disappointed by President Trump's proposed cuts to those vital programs, but remain committed to supporting much-needed Homeland Security grants to communities across the country. Whether terrorism, continued incidents of gun violence in our schools, or other attacks on our homeland, we need to do our part to provide the resources necessary to keep Americans safe and secure. I thank our witnesses for being here today, and Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the committee holding today's hearing, and I look forward to continued oversight of efforts on the important issue. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Other members are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. First, I ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a statement from Mr. Keating. He's unable to be here today. He's attending the funeral of Yarmouth Officer Sean Gannon, who was killed in the line of duty last week. Mr. Keating and I perhaps worked more closely than ever in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, which hit his hometown, including producing a joint investigative report. And I know he cares deeply about these issues before us today. So without objection, so ordered. We're pleased to have two distinguished panels of witnesses before us on this important topic. The first panel includes my hometown Chief of Police, Chief Brian Manley of Austin, Texas, and Mr. Bill Evans, a Commissioner of the Police Department for the City of Boston, Massachusetts, and Mr. Peter Newsom, the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Police Department of Washington, D.C., on behalf of the Major Cities Chiefs Association. I can't think of three better witnesses to testify on this topic. Your full written statements will appear in the record. The chair now recognizes Chief Manley for an opening statement.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Ms. Watson-Coleman, on behalf of Mr. Thompson, and honorable members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to address you today regarding the bombing incidents that took place in Austin last month. A string of attacks that took 2 lives from our community. Mr. Anthony House, a husband and father, and a 17-year-old amazing young man, musician and performer, Mr. Draylon Mason. I currently serve as the interim police chief of the Austin Police Department, and I'm here speaking in that capacity, but also on behalf of my mayor, Steve Adler, our city council, and our city manager, Spencer Cronk. The coordination that took place between this attack on our community, between our federal, state, and local officials, along with our elected and appointed leaders in our city, were a large reason on why we were as successful as we were in bringing this to as quick a resolution as we did, albeit not without significant loss of life and other lives that were changed forever based on the injuries that they sustained. I have submitted a brief that outlines the attacks that took place. For purposes of my testimony today, I'll just briefly cover them for the intent of being brief. The first attack that took place in our community was on March 2nd. Mr. Anthony House came out front of his home and found a package that had been delivered to his front doorstep. Upon picking up that package, the device exploded, and he was significantly injured, injuries that he later succumbed to at an area hospital. Move forward 10 days, and we had early morning hours, 17-year-old Draylon Mason goes out front of his residence. He finds a package on the doorstep. He picks it up and brings it inside. As he and his mother are opening this package in their kitchen, the device explodes. The injuries took Draylon's life on the scene, and his mother was seriously injured and transported for treatment. As we were on the scene of that event, hours later, we receive a call that there had been another explosion, this one in South Austin, and this one when 75-year-old Esperanza Herrera came outside of her residence and located a package that had been left there. She picked that package up. It too exploded, causing significant injuries from which she is still trying to recover. On March 18th, was notified in the evening hours after 8 p.m. that we had an explosion that took place south again. This one was different. This was a bomb that had been placed in a neighborhood on a side street with a tripwire that was strung across the sidewalk. And we had two males that were walking down the street and activated that tripwire. That device exploded, causing serious injuries to these two individuals, 22 and 23 years of age. On March 19th, we were notified that there was an explosion in a FedEx warehouse in Schertz, Texas, a city just north of San Antonio. A on-scene investigation revealed that we believe this device was linked to all of the Austin devices based on similarities. And with the ability to look into that, we found out the store in Austin where that package had been mailed from, and we were able to determine that that suspect not only mailed one package, but two. So we were able to backtrack that second package, and we found that it was sitting in a warehouse in Austin, waiting to be delivered to an address in Austin. So members of the Austin Police Department's bomb squad, along with support from Houston, San Antonio, and ATF, were able to render that device safe within that warehouse and collect a lot of valuable information from that one as well. The final bomb that exploded in this incident occurred on March 21st when the bomber's self-detonated device as members of the Austin Police Department SWAT team moved in on him. I often say I have the benefit of working with heroes every day, and nowhere has that been on display as it was on both March 20th and 21st, as members of law enforcement bomb squad rendered a device safe that was meant to kill or maim others in a very hazardous way. And also on March 21st, when members of the Austin Police Department SWAT team moved in on a suspect's vehicle, knowing the likelihood was high that he had an explosive device with him that would detonate, but they did their job that day because they knew if they didn't, others' lives were at risk and may be significantly harmed as well. Given the focus of today's hearing is on information sharing, I can't say enough about the collaboration that took place between federal, state, and local officials as we worked to bring this to a conclusion. Special Agent in charge of the FBI, Christopher Combs, and Special Agent in charge of the ATF, Fred Melanuski, from San Antonio and Houston, respectively, pretty much took up a residency in Austin throughout this investigation, and we were in lockstep as we worked towards bringing this to a conclusion. And while I did not have concerns about the assistance we'd get from our federal partners throughout this investigation, I was truly amazed by the number of agents that they brought to bear in Austin, along with the equipment and the skills, and again, that allowed us to bring this to a quick resolution. Colonel Steve McCraw of the Texas Department of Public Safety was also instrumental. He was a partner with us, and he gave us a lot of assistance through both the Texas Ranger Division, along with 100 troopers that served in Austin, patrolling, trying to not only keep the community safe, but provide a sense of safety during these difficult times. Chief Jessica Robledo of the Pflugerville Police Department and her officers were instrumental in the eventual search warrant at the suspect's residence that took place after we took the suspect down. And Chief Alan Banks of the Round Rock Police Department and his officers were instrumental as well as we ended up stopping the suspect in his city, and his officers were very helpful. Texas Governor Greg Abbott had offered any assistance that we needed and was also first to come to the table offering reward money for the identification of the suspect and any evidence that would lead to us locating him. I also want to acknowledge the Travis County District Attorney Margaret Moore and U.S. Attorney John Bash and their staffs. They were present throughout this investigation. They were in the command center with us, and they were advising us every step of the way so that we could ensure that if we ended up in a court of law, whether it be state or federal, that everything we did was consistent with those practices. And it was important to have them in with us. And Chairman McCall, you as well. We were in constant contact throughout this, and you were making sure that we had the resources that we needed to keep our city safe, and I appreciate that. When our community was at its worst, suffering at its worst, law enforcement was at its best, and our criminal justice partners were at their best. And while Austin didn't have anywhere enough assets to handle this on our own, the public safety assets that we did have was in a large part due to the Homeland Security grant funds that we had received as being part of a UASI city. We last received that funding in 2010, and now we rely on state Homeland Security grant funds that we have to share equitably amongst a 10-county region. So our ability to purchase the equipment and provide the training that is so essential in this area is challenged. And so to whatever extent possible for UASI funding to be returned to a level so that all partnering cities and all partnering entities have the ability to benefit from that program would be a recommendation. In conclusion, the events of March of 2018 have forever changed Austin. The lives of Mr. Anthony House and Mr. Draylon Mason have been taken and can never be returned, and they will not be forgotten. Our city will return to being a vibrant and inclusive city that we have been prior to this incident, and we will work to not forget the lessons learned. We will be stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Manley, and thank you for your service. You provide the leadership necessary. All eyes of the nation were on you, and you performed magnificently. Chair now recognizes Commissioner Evans for his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Thompson. Again, I'm Commissioner Evans. Been with the Boston Police Department for 38 years. I've been the commissioner for 4.5 years. I want to thank the members on behalf of Mayor Walsh and myself. I want to thank you for asking me to participate in this hearing today. My full testimony has been submitted to you for the record, and with the permission, I'd like to make a few opening remarks. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to remember fallen Yarmouth, Mass. Police officer Sean Gann. He was killed in the line of duty, serving a warrant last Thursday. Him and his K-9 officer, a K-9 dog, was also shot. He's being laid rest today. Last night I was at his wake. We had thousands of officers, but again, it goes to the dangers of being in this profession. So I'd like to recognize him. As I reflect on the 5th-year anniversary of the bombing of the Boston Marathon on April 15, 2013, which was 2 days ago, the importance of collaboration between federal, state, and local law enforcement partners is only reaffirmed. The same is true for the importance of communication between law enforcement, our public and private partners, and the communities we serve. As we watch events unfold across the country, it is clear that the timely sharing of information is at the center of a successful police and community response. This is so true for the recent bombings in Austin, Texas, which remind us all of how quickly tragedy can descend upon innocent citizens and cause senseless injury and death. This includes 39-year-old Stephen House, who was killed on his front porch, 17-year-old Drayton Mason, who was killed by a package at his home, while his mother was badly injured, and many others who were injured by the package bombs from, at that time, an unknown enemy. These tragic events all are too reminiscent of the Boston tragedy my city suffered during the 2013 marathon, including a lockdown and exhaustive manhunt by law enforcement, not knowing if or when the next attack might occur. While watching the news reports from Austin during this time, I understood and could relate to the police and the community's concern as an unidentified threat impacted their neighborhoods. Like Boston, the residents of Austin stood strong in the face of adversity, while its local leaders, including my co-panelists, Chief Brian Manley of the Austin Police Department and other Texas representatives, stood with one voice, one message, working to ease public tension while hunting for the killer. Also, I'd like to, in the aftermath of the marathon bombing, I knew that behind the scenes there was a team of men and women working around the clock to gather information and investigate leads while sharing the information across multiple law enforcement agencies, all with the common purpose to capture the suspect that was causing such distress and harm to our city. Ever since 9/11, information sharing between agencies, both large, small, local, state, and federal, has been the benchmark for successful prevention and response to threats. Trusting and open communications between law enforcement and federal partners are crucial to keeping our communities safe. I have witnessed the benefits of this type of information sharing firsthand, and it continues to improve the success of our agencies every day. At the center of these successful partnerships is this timely sharing of pertinent information. Chief Manley immediately responded to the events in Austin, with the FBI, the ATF joining him to work side by side during the investigation. As soon as the bombs went off in Austin, a network of information and data sharing was underway. These communications include facts of what was taking place in order to keep the community prepared appropriately, while also searching for similarities to other events in the area. Including in this intel network was the Austin Regional Intelligence Center, one of 7 centers in Texas and 78 across America under the Department of Homeland Security. The center began gathering and sharing intel in order to assist investigators on the street and across our nation. One of the early information law enforcement bulletins distributed by Texas Joint Information Fusion Center, even the sources the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, and a situational awareness bulletin on our approach to the explosive devices. This was developed through a bulletin that we all shared. The FBI San Antonio office was also forwarding situation awareness bulletins across the country into Boston. A long list of local, state, and federal partners kept communications channels opened across the country. This list included the FBI Office of Partner Engagement, the Department of Homeland Security, who continually shared information across the country. This network was especially important after an explosion was identified at the FedEx location 60 miles from Austin. The possibility that multiple explosions could have been shipped across the country was worthwhile for a lot of us. This allowed all jurisdictions to prepare should something come to the Boston area. In the end, Austin authorities, along with the Texas state assets, FBI, ATF, ultimately captured the suspect. But even here, although the threat was gone, the need for information didn't stop, and Texas leadership came together again to provide us with an overview of what occurred. This education will assist us all going forward. Another one of the most important aspects of successful information sharing is keeping everyone involved. See something, say something. In Boston, we had a long history of great relationship with our law enforcement partners, especially responding to critical assets. In Boston, recently we had an incident where a New England patriot, Julian Edelman, received a threat online. Our detectives were notified. We reached out to the Michigan Police Department, and we were able to bring that person into custody before he threatened to shoot up a school, which shows the importance of information there. This is why relations and information sharing is so crucial. It saves lives. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. I look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Evans. The chair now recognizes Chief Newsham for his testimony.
Good morning, Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Watson Coleman, and members of the committee. My name is Peter Newsham. I'm the Chief of Police for the Metropolitan Police Department here in Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to appear here today representing the Major City Chiefs, an association of police chiefs of the largest jurisdictions in the United States and Canada. We thank you for convening this hearing on a topic of critical importance to the safety of the people we protect and serve. Although we lead law enforcement agencies in the major urban areas of the United States, we know that law enforcement and agencies of all sizes share the same concerns about the threat of violent extremists and terrorism. There is no higher priority than coming together to share perspectives and lessons learned that may help prevent these tragedies and protect our communities. To that end, the Major City Chiefs has worked closely with the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, as well as the Department of Homeland Security and other federal agencies to strengthen information sharing since the Boston Marathon attacks. Today, we will report on progress and discuss next steps in our joint efforts. Collectively, all of our agencies realize the very real threat of lone wolf attackers. Lone wolves can be individuals radicalized by various ideologies at home or abroad, or may simply be someone facing a significant and untreated mental health issue. As we know, foreign and domestic extremist organizations have made headway in recruiting through the internet and other widespread propaganda. Information from our federal partners who track those who travel overseas for terrorist training indicates a decline in such travel. At the same time, however, we have seen a growing threat from violent domestic extremists who are motivated by hate and bias. This makes the role of local communities and law enforcement all the more important. One of our challenges is being able to identify individuals in the United States who have been radicalized through various forms of propaganda, and harder still to determine which of those pose an immediate public threat. Given the significant threat from lone wolf extremists, one of the most important tools in combating them is local information. One common thread running through these tragedies in recent years is that there have been warning signs that could be reported by the public and should be recognized by local and federal law enforcement. All too often, conversations about warning signs happen only after a tragedy occurs. We need systems in place to learn from neighbors, schools, employers, co-workers, and family members about persons who pose a threat, and we must pay attention to these warnings. For this reason, major city chiefs developed and piloted the Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, or SARS, that is now a permanent program at DHS. SARS was designed to provide information to the FBI threat database, eGuardian. Major city chiefs considers the SARS program to be the cornerstone of our information gathering from the community and believes it should remain a top priority for local and federal law enforcement. We appreciate this committee's support of this significant initiative. But there may be other effective tools for recognizing threats being developed in our communities. While law enforcement executives rely on our networks to identify programs, federal support to identify and disseminate technical assistance about innovative and best practices is vital. For instance, there is a growing move to pass state legislation that supports red flag laws. The major city chief supports and encourages these laws that would provide family and community members with an avenue for seeking court-ordered emergency risk protection orders to allow for the removal of firearms from individuals that pose a threat to our communities. While these programs rely on locally driven efforts, information sharing always needs to be a two-way street. Local agencies can be the eyes and ears to gather information from local communities. Federal agencies, for their part, must share with local law enforcement intelligence and other resources. I will highlight just some of the ways that federal agencies provide critical support for our work in communities. Following the Boston attack and hearings held by this committee, major city chiefs engaged with the FBI to review and change a number of policies and procedures. The common purpose of these efforts was to remove barriers to sharing information that could prevent an incident of mass violence. Over a period of months, the FBI considered and approved a comprehensive set of measures to expand participation by local agencies in regional joint terrorism task force operations and to fully share all case information and threat intelligence. This resulted in barriers coming down. Specific areas of improvement included increasing local access to classified information, expanding responsibilities for local personnel assigned to JTTFs, regular briefings for local agencies on threat intelligence and case activities, and fully embedding local personnel in all aspects of daily JTTF operations. Major city chiefs has also joined with major county sheriffs to form a network of senior intelligence officers from every urban area, an organization without precedent in this country. Each jurisdiction has designated an intelligence commander. Working as a team, these intelligence commanders exchange information and share intelligence about threats, prevention, and response. We coordinate these efforts with the JTTF in each urban area, the fusion centers, and DHS. Major city chiefs appreciates the support of the FBI and DHS for the Intelligence Commanders Network, which is a critical component of Major City Chiefs' criminal intelligence enterprise. The CIE aims to better integrate local criminal intelligence and counterterrorism operations. The effort leverages existing networks such as the JTTF and fusion centers to improve connectivity between state and local enforcement resources. Major City Chiefs is also very excited that the FBI has formally joined with us to establish a common automated platform called the Threat Reporting Priorities. The FBI has sponsored both development and maintenance of the platform, as well as training our personnel. Later this month, DHS and the FBI will host a meeting in Houston to move this initiative forward. These are just a few of the ways that Major City Chiefs and local and federal law enforcement work together to protect our communities. While great strides have been made, we recognize that it is not enough. Recent tragedies are a grim reminder that there is still much work to do. Major City Chiefs plans to meet with FBI Director Christopher Wray and executives to review current JTTF and eGuardian policies to determine how we can further strengthen information sharing. Major City Chiefs plans to evaluate common policies and procedures, threat briefings for urban areas, the role of local police personnel, reporting threat intelligence, and intelligence operations. In closing, I would like to thank the chairman, the ranking member, and the committee for your strong support of local law enforcement. We know you share our commitment to evaluating and implementing policies and programs that will strengthen the partnership between local law enforcement and federal partners. Collectively, we are all sworn to serve and protect our communities. That is a responsibility which I am sure will guide all of our efforts. Thank you, and I'm available to take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Chief Newsham. I now recognize myself for questions. I was a federal prosecutor both before 9/11 and after. 9/11 represented a very significant failure in intelligence and information sharing between the intelligence community, federal law enforcement, and state, resulting in the Twin Towers being brought down, the Pentagon being struck, and this building, we believe, was the final target. That's why this committee was formed. That's why the department was formed, to make sure that doesn't happen again. When the Boston bombing occurred, I have to say it raised serious questions about whether we were connecting the dots, whether this information sharing was working. I had Commissioner Ed Davis testify before this committee, who told me that he knew nothing about an FBI guardian lead being open on Tamerlan Tsarnaev, that he knew nothing of the foreign intelligence warning. He knew nothing of his travels to Dagestan and back, even though a customs flag went up on him. He knew nothing about the post-radical online postings. In short, what he told me was that he didn't know he had a terrorist in his backyard, and he had 2 police officers on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And he said, you know, if I had known that, maybe I would have given him a second look. And the answer I got back at the federal level was, well, that case was closed and it wouldn't have made a difference. I think it possibly could have. But we're not here to look backwards. We're here to look forward. And Commissioner Evans and Chief Newsham, I think you've outlined some very good lessons learned since that time. But can you tell me what we have learned since that time and what you're doing, how that has improved since the Boston bombing?
Sure, Chairman. I think the information sharing, at least since I've been commissioner, has improved so much. You know, if not weekly contact, sometimes daily contact with Hank Shaw, who's the special agent in charge. And we've had a lot of events, whether they were free speech marches, like the week after Charlottesville, you know, constant daily contact about who was traveling where, what threats were to the city. You know, just 2 days ago with the Boston Marathon bombing, you know, continually in touch with Hank on, is there any threat to what's going on? And working with the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, as well as, you know, the JTTF, as well as the fusion centers, you know, we were pretty comfortable that we had a pretty secure event. And I think the communication, you know, the access to Guardian, that's all really has improved. And, if we had a big anti-gun rally, like everything we do now is through the state and our federal partners. And I got to say, since Boston, I know there was some criticism of the FBI, but I don't see it right now. I think the communication has gotten so much better. It really has. And anything, always, I reach out to the special agent in charge, and it's just almost daily communication. So I got to say, sometimes, there's some criticism, but even at the FBI, at the final takedown in Watertown, I ran that final scene. I tell the story that's not told that when it was very hectic, the HR team came up to me and they made clear, asking me, are you the man in charge? Are you the incident commander? I said, yeah. And they said, well, every decision we're going to make from here on in is going to be through you. And whether they're throwing smoke grenades or flashbangs, they didn't take over. They worked with us. And I think ever since that time, the relationship has got stronger. The communications has gotten better. So I see that things have really improved, especially on the anniversary of the 5-year bombing.
And thank you. I think one of the big improvements, I think, came from this committee's report. And I commend the FBI for entering into memorandums of understanding with the police chief so that they're participants on the JTTF, that they can actually talk about it. Right. And I think that was a big breakthrough as a result. And Chief, very briefly, because my time is
I would just echo some of the comments that were made, and to say that it has dramatically improved the information sharing from the FBI. The members of my JTTF that interact with the Bureau on a daily basis are frequently in my office, bringing up instances that I need to be aware of in the event that we have to move resources to address those issues. So I've noticed a dramatic improvement in the level of access that my task force officers have to information that the Bureau has, and then they immediately share that information. For larger issues that occur, there's a direct communication between me and the assistant director in charge over at the Washington field office.
And Chief Manley, I think the Austin bombing, the way you handled it, your leadership represents how it's supposed to work. And I think it represents the progress we've made since the Boston bombing as a country. I personally, I visited with the ATF, and you and I visited, and Steve McCraw, who's a hero of mine, and I also went over to the FBI field office to thank them and present a flag to them, to over 50 agents. And I was actually, it was remarkable, the change of culture within the FBI, that, we were here to support the police chief. We are working hand in glove with him. And they provided great technical analysis and data that I know really greatly facilitated your investigation. And I thought, what a sea change for the better. Can you comment on that, and how I believe that what happened, while tragic in Austin, has become somewhat of a model, I think, looking forward?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I would echo the comments of the Commissioner and the Chief as well on what we do in Austin. I won't spend time on that with the partnerships with JTTF and the information sharing that is absolutely taking place. But as we worked through the bombing spree in Austin, we formed a unified command, and we had senior representatives. If it wasn't Mr. Milanowski and Mr. Combs and myself, then it was our seconds that were present in that unified command center, so that we had people that were capable, authorized, and willing to make the decisions that needed to be made. And it was a constant sense of partnership. There was never once a request or an attempt to move the overall investigation out of the purview of the police department, but instead it was a sense of support in making sure that we had what we needed to have. The events that took place in Austin would have overwhelmed any police department across this country, the largest included. To have the federal assets come into town, to be able to go through the amount of data we were pulling, whether it was computer leads, whether it was video, everything that had to be pulled together to try and make that critical link, there was never a hesitation. And when needed, there were additional resources that were brought to bear. So the partnership, again, between the agencies, the agreement on the front end, and I think the constant communication throughout the event is what I think we should model going forward for a community that would find themselves in this circumstance, praying that they don't, but if they do, this absolutely worked. I really do believe that in that command center that everyone left their initials at the door, whether that was FBI, ATF, APD, or the others that were there. Those initials were left at the door because we realized we had a community under siege and lives at risk, and I really think that's the model going forward.
I couldn't agree more, and I think, sir, you certainly earned your stripes. And with that, let me recognize Ranking Member Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for your testimony. It's been very helpful and enlightening, and I'm learning a lot, and I really need to learn more here. Chief Manley, that was an incredible, was it 19 days of horror in your community, and I know that we're very pleased that there was this collaboration and support and information sharing. I have a couple of questions, though, about why it took 19 days to find this particular individual. So I'd like to know, like, what was being shared between the first incident and the second incident, which is the 2nd to the 12th? That's different than what happened from the 19th to the 21st, where we actually caught this individual. And please understand, this is not a criticism. I'm just trying to figure out, was there a way of, like, sort of compressing the time in which we would have found what seems to be a rather unsophisticated and troubled individual?
Yes, Congresswoman. So what happened on March 2nd, although we did not have reason to believe in that moment that this was part of a larger incident, what we had was a singular bomb that had taken the life of an individual. We still brought in the ATF, we still brought in the FBI and the U.S. Postal Service that day on the 2nd. They were on the scene. We actually sent all of the evidence with the ATF. We had them conduct the post-blast analysis, and we did not try and handle that within the resources of the police department, recognizing the severity of what had happened. So in those interceding days between the 2nd and the 12th, when we had the 2 additional bombs that went off that day, there was a lot of work being done in the background. There was ATF working to analyze the bomb components, again, hoping to find some type of either biological evidence that might link to a suspect or identify the components that were used to construct the device, because then we look to try and see where those are available and we work backwards. A lot of information was being gathered regarding purchases, regarding suspicious persons, and so all of that is being looked at in these interceding days. What happened on March 12th with the first bomb that went off taking the life of Mr. Draylen Mason is at that moment we realized that it would be too coincidental to have 2 isolated incidents, and that this was definitely this was a pattern. And so at that point, we put together that unified command, and we brought in a lot of additional personnel, and we set up a command center. And so it's not that there was a different approach. I think we then had the availability of a lot more evidence. We now had 2 additional blast scenes to investigate. Additional evidence was collected at both. And again, we started getting more tips because these were now 2 additional neighborhoods that could tell us, did they notice someone out of place? Did they notice something out of place? 2 additional neighborhoods where we could go and retrieve video data from that we could analyze and look for suspicious persons or suspicious vehicles. So I think the biggest change was with these additional scenes, it provided us additional evidence and additional potential witnesses that we were then able to feed into the larger system we had constructed back at the command center to try and collate all of this data.
So you had, excuse me, so you did have community people who saw something and said something. So that's a component of this, right?
Absolutely.
So,
go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, we did have community people that we canvassed each neighborhood after these incidents took place, and we.
I want to take up on. I'm going to take up on a little bit of that right there, but I want to just ask this sort of a side question. Was there any relationship information established between the bomber and the 3 residences?
To this point, we do not have any connection between the bomber and the 3 residences, but instead it appears purely random. But I do want to say this is still an active investigation, and we still have a lot of records and computer files and all that are actively being analyzed just to make sure, number one, there's no link to any of the victims, but then also that there are no other individuals that are involved in this.
You all did a remarkable job. I watched it. You know, I was glued to the TV as everyone else was, and the same thing with the Boston Marathon bombings. We were glued to the TV, and we were just very proud of law enforcement solving these individuals, solving these problems, and making us a little bit more secure in our comings and goings, because that's where we're threatened, just in our comings and goings. This see something, say something is very important here. And over the past year, there have been numerous cases of concerned citizens reporting suspected terrorism-related activity or the possible radicalization of members within their community to the authorities. Given that these actions have in some cases led to successful investigations and arrests, there is a growing perception among some that community engagement is emerging as a critical counterterrorism tactic. At the same time, particularly given the rhetoric from this administration toward racial, ethnic, and religious minorities, many are indeed concerned that they could be a target of unfounded and discriminatory reporting from their neighbors simply because of their religion or how they look or whatever. How do you balance these concerns, and how do you ensure that individuals' privacy and civil liberties are being respected while still encouraging community engagement and appropriate reporting? And this is actually a question I'd love to hear from each of you. We can start with you, Mr. Manley.
Certainly. I think it is how you approach the information that you've been given. Absolutely, the See Something, Say Something campaign is vital to the safety of communities across this country. No community has enough police officers to keep the community safe on their own, and without active, effective partnerships, the community is not as safe as it needs to be. So while understanding the concerns that exist within communities across this country, I think it's how law enforcement approaches these tips when we get them, to make sure that what has been reported is something that could truly be threatening, and that you then work the information that you're given before you actually go out and take any action.
To your knowledge, are police departments being sort of retrained, culturally informed now? And I want to ask Mr. Newsham the same question on behalf of the association, because it is important how the law enforcement reacts to these tips that are coming in and concerns that are being raised.
Yes, Congresswoman, I agree, and I think I'll speak for my department. We regularly train officers in the area of cultural sensitivity and diversity, most recently having put the entire police department through fair and impartial police training, where we look at biases, both conscious and unconscious biases, and how those can impact your thought, but how you cannot let them impact your actions. So speaking for my agency, we've taken some pretty aggressive stance towards this.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, ma'am, and that's really that's a great question, the question that you ask, and the way that Major City Chiefs looks at this issue is that you know the bottom line for any police organization is building trust and legitimacy within the communities that they serve. And the reason that you need trust and legitimacy is for the very reason, the question that you raise. There probably will be suspicious activity reports to law enforcement that are unfounded for a host of reasons. And the community has to trust that the police agencies have had the training on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, to be able to respond to those situations, to make sure that we're keeping our community safe from extremists and from terrorism. And the only way that the communities are going to make those reports if they trust the agencies that they're reporting it to. And the bottom line for law enforcement agencies is to ensure that their police officers are trained to recognize the difference.
Just to close up on this question, if I might, is there standardized training mechanisms to deal with this so that all the police forces who are willing to train their their employees are getting the same sort of information so that there is sort of continuity and a consistency in the training.
Yeah, major city chiefs, what we do is when we have our conferences and we discuss these issues with the major city chiefs across the country, we try to express to them that they have to have these types of trainings. But the answer to your question is I don't believe there is a standardized training that's being applied to all the agencies across the country.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses here today for the testimony. Chief Manley, I want to especially congratulate you on the outstanding job and the leadership you demonstrated during these recent tragedy and throughout your career. But I want to thank you for that. And Chief Newsom, we've had dealings over the years, and again, thank you for your efforts. Commissioner Evans, if I could just follow up some questions on the situation in Boston. I remember being up there, I guess, just several weeks or months after the Boston Marathon bombings, meeting with you and Commissioner Davis and all your men and women, and the great job that you did. One thing that struck me at the time, though, was, for instance, how close Watertown was, how there was almost interconnection between Boston police, Watertown police. It was hard even to see the geographic boundaries at times. When you do your training and when you do share intelligence and when you coordinate activities, are those smaller departments part of your training, part of your planning?
Yes, they are. With the Boston Regional Intelligence Center, every morning we do a conference call with all the surrounding URC cities and in Watertown. We do it with our state police officers and our federal. So anything going on, whether it's crime-related, whether it's anything related to terrorism or any type of threats, that's shared with everyone. And, you know, it's a great informational source. If they have issues in their town, they're letting us know. And, you know, it's a daily sharing of information. And we do that every single day. And at the end of the day, we put out a BRIC report that's shared with everyone. So there's a lot of good information sharing across lines, you know, all across the state.
Now, at the time of the your final showdown in Boston, you were the incident commander, but that was in Watertown. Was that agreed upon beforehand?
No, you know,
PD?
we were out there searching all day, and the city was shut down. And actually, I was there from 1 o'clock in the morning, and we were just going from house to house looking for the second suspect. And honestly, the city was shut down. And what happened was, at 6 o'clock, the governor released the stay-in-place order, and we were still out there searching. And all of a sudden, someone came running up to me and said they had seen someone in the boat. And so we quietly went to the boat, and myself and 2 of my lieutenants were the first one on the boat. And I walked into the leadership position because I was the superintendent at the time. I was the highest ranking official, even though I was in Watertown, which honestly, I'm a city kid. I don't know all the streets. I had no idea where I was, to tell you the truth, but I was in the right place at the right time, and I took control of that scene. And whether it was the state or the federal or the ATF, everyone let me run with that scene. So I just happened on the scene, and I think that was great about it. There was no fighting over who was the commander. We all had a mission, and the mission was to get that individual in the boat out of there. And thank God we did, because I think we got a lot of information as far as what his motives were, and that there was no other threat out there.
God forbid something like that happen again, though. Would there still be that connectivity between the various police departments? I'm just trying to imagine something like that in other jurisdictions where you have 3 or 4 police departments coming together and in such a unexpected situation.
Yeah, I think it's crazy, because that's one of the big issues we battle with now when we have such a rapidly developing situation, that whole idea of controlling all the outside agencies. I mean, it just wasn't 3 or 4. I think we had about 8 different agencies. And when the shots rang out, you know, I was the one screaming for everyone to hold their fire. But the issue was, all of these other agencies didn't have my radio frequency, but we were able to, by word of mouth, stop all the firing. So I think self-deployment is the big issue, and I think we all struggle with it. How do you stop the cavalry from coming in when everyone knows, whether it's Austin, whether it's D.C.? You know, officers run towards the danger, but unfortunately, sometimes they run without reporting to a command post. So that was very hectic, and we learned from that. That's one of the major things. How do you stop people from all rushing in? And when the shots fired, we were more concerned with the crossfire, actually, because everyone was around the boat at that point. And I was screaming for people to stop their agencies from coming in, but it sort of got a little out of control at the end, and thank God nobody was more seriously hurt. But that's a thing we struggle with, sir, that how do we better control those final scenes where everybody wants to get the bad guy, but there's got to be a lot more restraint.
Okay. I have very little time remaining. If each of you could just very quickly, the importance of the federal grants, again, to each of you, how important they are, the Homeland Security grants, as far as coping with the threats.
Well, I always look back at how Boston responded after the bombing, and we had done Urban Shield right before that, where we had a multi-agency training program where we practice what-ifs, with different terrorist bombings going on in different parts of the city. And that way we got to know everybody's capabilities and what they bring to the table. And we did training with the hospitals. We did it with the universities. We did it, and it was through the URC money that pulled that off. So when you talk about how we responded, we had everyone off that scene within 22 minutes. 270 people went to the hospitals. Unfortunately, 3 who were severely wounded and passed, they stayed on the scene, but everyone got out of there. But that doesn't happen by accident. The training with the hospitals, with everyone, and we always look back and say, thank God we had the Homeland Security money to do that training, because that was instrumental, and we continually use it. We did an active shooter exercise last year at Fenway Park. I think we were the first ones to do it at a major sporting event. How would we respond to an incident in Fenway Park? And all our federal, state agencies were there, and we did an active shooting incident. Leading up to this year's marathon, we did tabletop exercises on what-ifs. We do active shooter training. We've probably done 400 in the last 2 years. And, Naval Postgraduate School down in Monterey, we send officers to. All that grant money really helps us become a more effective and efficient department, ready for the next tragedy. And hopefully it never comes, but that makes us ready for these events, Chair.
Mr. Chairman, if the other chiefs could respond in writing to the question of the impact of federal grants.
Yeah, the chief would respond in writing.
And let me also acknowledge Superintendent Leiden, who's here. It was good to see you again, sir.
Well, just echo my colleague's point. If it wasn't for that Homeland Security grant money, I believe there were exercises done about a month before the Boston bombing. And when you had that number of injured people being triaged to hospitals, I think the loss of life could have been far greater if it wasn't for that training.
I agree. I look back, I still have a lot of relationships with a lot of the individuals who suffered, loss of legs, and they talk about the treatment they got at those hospitals and the response. And, I'm proud we all came together. And again, if it wasn't for that training through Urban Shield, I don't think we would have had nearly as great a response. So I'm a big supporter in the Homeland Security and all they do for us.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo what my colleague, Congressman King, and certainly the chairman said about how important it is for the federal government not just to talk about how important these collaborations are, but especially in a post-9/11 world when terrorism is even more rampant now than it was back then. We have to back up our talk with money. And I want to acknowledge the chairman of this committee who has consistently fought for local law enforcement agencies to get the money from the federal government, not to say you're on your own, we'll help you in other ways, but we're not going to give you any money. And I think that says a lot about Mr. McCall, because he said it during the Obama administration as long as I've been here, and he's saying it now. So this is not a political issue for him, nor is it, I believe, for the rest of the members of this committee. And it's clearly, obviously, important to all the work that you're doing. Mr. Manley, I just want to ask you some questions about the Austin attacks. There was a videotape, the killer left.
Yes, so the bomber used a video camera to make a recording. Now, there's really no visual because it's inside appears to be a dark vehicle, but it is an audio recording between 25 to 28 minutes long.
And what does he talk about?
So without going into the specifics, he's talking about his life. He actually fully described the 6 bombs that we recovered, which again allowed us to believe that we had recovered all of the devices that he had constructed. That was a concern given that he kept changing his delivery method, from a package left on a front porch to a tripwire activated, and then he went to using the mail system. So we were very concerned about that. He talked about his feelings about the bombings or lack thereof, talked about mistakes that he made in what he believed would allow us to capture him, and that was the majority of what he talked about. What we were looking for was motive, was
Did it
reason.
give you any insight into his motive?
There was no insight into his motive. Instead, just
There was no racial implication or anything like that, or any religious implications at all?
no, and that's what we were looking for, because that would have been a determining factor of whether this would have fallen under federal terrorism statutes or FBI jurisdiction. And there was nothing on that recording whatsoever that revealed any ideology, specifically one either based in religion or politics.
Is there a reason why that has not been released publicly?
A couple reasons. First of all, it's still an active investigation, and
Is there
so
reason to believe that there were other people involved?
not what we know of right now. Now, there's a lot of other data that we're still working through. Our federal partners have some computers that they're still conducting the analysis on. I'm told there's over 1 terabyte of data that's having to be analyzed now. So we're not done with this investigation. We don't believe at this point that there's anybody else involved, but we're not willing to say that until we know so. And the second reason really is the contagion effect, and what we know that when individuals that either conduct mass shootings, or in this case, this bombing spree, we don't want to potentially influence others that might be considering this, or if there is an individual that wants the type of infamy that one can gain by having their words and their recordings and their manifestos out in the public domain, really until eternity with the internet now.
Well, I understand that, but I also think that it's important to use each case as instruction. And if you talk about the program, if you see something, say something, having more information about what the motives or mindset of this individual was might help people identify that similar behavior in people elsewhere. And I just want to talk, there was an editorial in the Austin American-Statesman that disagreed with the fact that most major news outlets didn't label these bombings an act of terrorism. And they said, there is no mistaking the fear these attacks inflicted on an entire city. That makes this terrorism. And I think that most people agree with that. The New York Times also wrote that racial and religious privilege appear to have intersected in how this bomber was perceived. Because he is white, his acts were reduced to a personal problem, and since he is a Christian, his faith was considered coincidental. And so one of the big focuses of this committee is making sure that the terrorism, we don't allow it to come here. But we have to be willing to acknowledge that acts like this, that there was a neighborhood that was terrorized by an individual. It turned out to be just one individual, could have been by more. And I think we can't try to sugarcoat things or not release things, because in every other case, we know the history of every posting on Facebook or whatever these people said. And I don't think that has gone down the path that you suggested, where you might be inciting people to behave in a similar way. But I appreciate your decision as a law enforcement agency for sure, and I applaud the way that your entire department handled this under your leadership. One last question, because I have very few seconds left. Can I ask just the entire panel if for all three of your opinion about how a national comprehensive universal background check system, in your opinions, would it help prevent mass shootings?
Well, I can speak. Obviously, I believe so. I'm a big, strong advocate of universal background checks. I think Massachusetts, more than any state, probably has the toughest gun laws out there. And as a result, we have the lowest gunshot deaths of any country. And I think it comes because we have tough gun laws. Anyone who wants to get a license to carry in the city of Boston has to go through, I have to sign off on it. And we watch those very closely. And if someone has a felony, domestic violence, they have anything in their background that sends up a red flag, they will not get a license to carry. And I think that's why, as a city, a major city, last year we had I think 55 homicides on the year, which is pretty impressive given other cities of our size. But that doesn't happen by accident. That happens because we have tough gun laws. Our big issue in the city of Boston is you can go up to New Hampshire and Maine, and that's where almost 20% of guns that come into our state come from. And Anthony Braga from Northeastern also indicated almost 25% of our guns come from the I-95 South. They're coming from North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia, and so we're having a problem with guns flowing in because all around us are gun laws that are lax. And quite frankly, I worry because there's talk coming out of Washington that this whole idea of reciprocity of gun laws, where someone in a state that has lax gun laws, they'll have the ability to cross lines and have the same laws as they have in our state. And so I've come out strongly. I know a lot of the major city chiefs were all worried about gun laws, especially if you're in a city chief, about gun laws being weaker because, every day in our country we have about 300 people who get killed on our streets by guns. And, we have a major problem in us. And I always say, I go to a lot of these scenes, and I think if we've seen the mothers, if you've dealt with the mothers, I think people would understand why we need comprehensive universal background check. I see it. I see the dangers it does. I see so many young African-American kids killed on our streets, and that's why we need stricter gun laws.
Yeah, I would agree. Major city chiefs is supportive of universal background checks. I think we refer to them as common sense legislation that's needed across the country. And, you talk about the question I think you asked was whether or not that would prevent some of these mass attacks that we've had in our country. And the answer to that is yes. But to echo what the commissioner said, it would also prevent the shootings that we're seeing in our inner cities. And I don't think you'll find a major city chief that disagrees with that.
Mm-hmm. And just briefly, I will agree with my colleagues on the panel as well that I think it's a very effective tool. I don't think that it will impede those that want to purchase weapons and that should possess weapons from being able to, but I think it's a strong step towards keeping them out of the hands of individuals that should not possess them.
Thank you all very much. You're our front line, and we're very lucky to have you all in your service. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to initially echo the sentiments of my colleagues on the committee that it's all well and good to make inquiries, but if we don't provide you the financial tools to fight the fight on the good fight on the front lines, then we're not doing our job. And so I think we have the commitment of the committee as a whole here to make sure that we always can get to as much money and as much funding and support as we possibly can because we understand what's at stake. And I must say, speaking with you before the hearing today and talking to you and listening to this today makes me miss my 20 years as a federal organized crime prosecutor very much. And during that time, I spent an awful lot of time when you do organized crime cases of task force concepts, and which were really the precursor to the National Fusion Centers. So I kind of want to talk about the fusion centers a little bit and just kind of see see how well they're operating or how well you use them and what we can do better. And some of the things I want to examine, in addition to just if you're using them, what problems you have, is I'd like a candid discussion about a couple of things that I've been concerned with in the past. Any task force, any fusion center, anytime you have collaborative efforts, the strength of each person on that is important, but together it's much stronger. And a lot of times it seems like when the locals get on, they don't get the status or the priority that maybe the feds get or maybe the state representatives get. And especially when it comes to like background checks and how long it takes them to get their security clearances, how long is it taking them to become a full-fledged member, and are they getting access to all the information so they can be as effective a member of the team as possible? So with that, I want to ask you, first of all, Chief Manley and then Commissioner Evans, tell me what level of participation do you have in the fusion centers, and what do you see as some of the concerns or problems you have with it?
So thank you, Congressman. And I guess I would initially go with Austin. We actually, with our UASI dollars, opened up the Regional Intelligence Center. And this is where we partner with, I believe, 19 other immediate agencies around us so that we can make sure we're sharing information, we're connecting the dots, and we're not missing something. And again, that would not likely have been possible for our area without the UASI funding. That's how we invested our dollars, along with some training. As far as the partnerships and the participation and the recognition by our federal and state partners, I'm not aware that we have had any challenges in that area as far as getting either access to information or being given a second seat at the table. But instead, what I sense is that the partnership is equal, and that we're getting not only and I don't want to say recognition, but we are getting the attention that we need, and our issues are being brought front. And I think that that's an improvement. I think that that goes along with what we're talking about today, the improved cooperation. But the cost of running an operation like that, as I said, I don't know that we ever would have been able to stand that up without the investment in the with the UASI dollars, and that's what's important to us, is to see that continue.
Yeah, it's certainly a force multiplier, task forces and fusion centers, and you get a heck of a lot more bang for your buck by putting a body or two there with all the others who bring their strengths to the table as well. Commissioner Evans, I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about how the hell the Bruins choked the other night, but I can't do that because it's not the proper place, but maybe later. But I want to ask you the same question about the fusion centers, your participation, if you have any concerns with it.
I don't. I think, in Boston, we have a real active. I think, we're one of the most active. I think we have about 50 individuals who work in our fusion center. We have someone assigned here to D.C. in the National Operations Center. So getting that real-time information was key. When Chief Manley was dealing with his incidents, we were getting real-time information about what was going on. And even recently, some of the intel we've gotten from that. Last week, working with the FBI, we got information on an individual who might have a storage of guns in his home, who was, unstable. We talked to his wife, he was paranoid. And through that information sharing, we did a search warrant on his home, and we got 5 rifles, 1 shotgun, and 7 high-powered handguns. And so that came about as a result of the sharing in the Fusion Center. So we're getting a lot of good information, and working across this country. When anything happens, we're getting real-time information on whether it's terrorism, whether it's a person who has mental issues. And so it's a great source of information for us.
We spent a considerable amount of time trying to make sure that that's the case, so it's encouraging to hear that information with the fusion centers. I'll ask all 3 panel members, and then my time will be up. One of the concerns we have had is when you have new members from your departments going to the fusion centers or these task forces, there's often a tremendous lag in the amount of time when they ultimately get their security clearances, and then so they can get exposed to all the information that's available to the others on the fusion centers and task forces. Have you any of you experienced any recent problems with delays in getting the security clearances for your folks that are on these task forces? And we can start with Mr. Newsham.
I think some of the experience that you described of the significant delays is kind of the old school situation that we had, so it does appear to be improving. I also understand that getting the background checks is a lengthy process, and it has to be very thorough before you're going to allow anyone to have access to that information. So, just talking from major cities chiefs' perspectives and the conversations that I've had with the other members of major city chiefs, that there certainly has been an improvement. And
that's really good to hear. Commissioner?
I agree. I mean, it has gotten better. I can tell you, I remember applying. They basically ask you everything but your shoe size on that, and I've never gone such.
They're not asking your shoe size. They're supposed to, I think.
I know, but it's a long process. But to get the clearance, they have to vet people well, and unfortunately, it doesn't move as quick as we like it. But that's unfortunately part of the process. Whether you have foreign ties, foreign investments, they ask you everything, and so they're very thorough. And unfortunately, sometimes that can be longer than we want.
Okay, well, that's one of the concerns we do have, is that they need to move. Once you get on the task force, you're not effective if you're not getting the information. Right. And Chief?
I would concur, and especially what the commissioner just said. The process itself is a lengthy process, but I don't believe that local officials are getting put in a back seat to others. I think that we're getting processed just as quickly as others. However, the process itself is rather arduous. Okay,
things seem like they're improving. That's good to hear. Thank you all, gentlemen, very much for all what you do, and I hope and pray every day for that law enforcement is safe and that we don't have any more terrorist concerns in this country. It's not realistic to think they're not coming, but it's also realistic to think that we're doing as much as we possibly can, and that's because of folks like you. So thank you very much.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Let me thank the chairman, and let me thank Ms. Watson Coleman for her presence as vice chair today, and let me also acknowledge Mr. Thompson, the ranking member, for this hearing. Also, I want to acknowledge Chief Manley and Chief Evans and Chief Newsham for their leadership and service to the nation. I too want to, however, mention and give accolades to the late Barbara Bush. We in Houston are particularly chauvinistic and enthusiastic about the fact that we had both President H.W. Bush and his lovely bride as our constituents and as residents of our great city. And although the nation is mourning, we in Houston and we in Texas are shedding tears. For as a member of that community, I would always see Barbara Bush with her smiling face advocating for things that help people. And during Hurricane Harvey, they were still standing as moral compass for those who are suffering. I thank them for their efforts together, but I thank her for setting the tone for what a leading First Lady is and should be. And I give to her family my deepest sympathy. This is a very important hearing, and I want to start by indicating that this is somewhat a new phenomenon that we have to deal with here in the United States. And so my questions will be somewhat pointed, but they will not be personal. And the help that you all can give me and give us as a committee will be, I think, extremely important. First, Chief Manley, I do want to acknowledge in this instance, as I offer sympathy to the Chief Evans from Boston, to all of those who are lost in these terroristic acts. I want to mention Anthony Stephan House, a fellow Texan, was the first individual that lost his life, 39 years old, a father, a humble man who was doing nothing wrong and opened an unmarked package, as I understand. And certainly want to give sympathy to his family. And then to Draylon Mason, who not only has a connection in Austin, but has a connection all the way to Houston, Texas, talented bass player with a bright future. I understand that those who attended his homegoing service were just simply amazed at the genius of this young man and the service he had already given in his young 17 years. Sympathy to his mother, who is healing as well, and his grandfather, who is a major leader, major clergy, who many of my pastors in Houston know and are mournful of his loss. Chief Manley, it's important to note how quickly you responded to the bombing of the first victim to let the community know just what was happening so that they would be on notice that something had gone awry.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We held a press conference on March 2nd, the day of that first bombing. I was with members of both the ATF and the FBI, and we briefed our community on what had happened, on the fact that it was a package that had exploded, and again, wanting to make sure that the community was aware that that's how this murder had taken place. So on the day of the incident, we did have a conversation through the media about what had happened. We came back, I believe it was 3 days later, we gave a press conference that Monday with an update on the investigation, what we had conducted to that point. And in that press conference, it was an assistant chief who conducted that one, specifically went over the importance of suspicious packages and steps that we would want the community to take if they felt like there was a suspicious package, ways that they would report that, things to avoid doing, such as touching or handling. And so that was a conversation that took place the day of, as as we talked about how it had happened, but then we followed up the following, I believe it was Monday, with a more detailed press conference talking about safety around suspicious packages.
So you understand the impact in the African-American community as relates to bombs, the bombings of the little girls in Birmingham. The atmosphere was a terrorizing atmosphere. Did you interact with the NAACP? And to both Chief Evans, we do not have a federal crime under domestic terrorism. What do you think, how effective would that be? And if you're getting my two questions, how effective would it be to have a defined crime of domestic terrorism? I know some states have it. We have a definition, but not a crime. But I think it's important in Chief Manley's point is that the first two victims were African Americans. It would lead people who have been subjected to this violence to think in that manner. Were you sensitive to that? And did you ultimately recognize that this was a terrorizing effect and call this terrorism? And Mr. Evans, I'll ask you about the domestic terrorism. Yes, Mr. Manley.
So I think we addressed it in the media briefing that we did, realizing on March 12th when the second bomb went off that this was not in fact an isolated incident as we believed it may have been on that first one on March 2nd. And we were aware that both
And there was no reason to Mr. Manley was not a criminal. So you all, you know, that was, I'm sorry, his name's not Manley. Mr. House was not a criminal. You finally recognized that it wasn't his fault.
Yes, this was not of his doing, and we recognized that as we investigated. I think, as with most homicide investigations, your investigator will start off looking at the victim because that leads you in the direction of who may have wanted to do them harm. So I think that it is a normal step that you take in an investigation such as this. If you don't immediately have witnesses that can tell you why it happened or who had done it, you've got to try and piece together the person's life to understand who would want to do them harm. So I know those steps were taking place. And then as far as being sensitive, I think we realized and spoke about it after March 12th when we had the second victim. We recognized that both of the bombings at that point had occurred in East Austin, which is where a majority of our minority community lives, and that both victims were in fact victims of color. And we were speaking about it at that time, saying that while we don't have any specific link to terrorism or to hate, we cannot rule that out either. So we kept that as a possibility throughout the entire investigation. That is still a possibility today, as we still have a lot of evidence to sift through. We just do not have anything at this point that would lead to that type of a motivation, but that is still part of the ongoing investigation.
Chief Evans, can you discuss the domestic terrorism dilemma that we have?
Well, in our particular case, obviously, we had 4 individuals killed, so that did go that way. And Tamerlan Sinanoff II, he was charged federally under that, and now he sits on death row because of that. But I think obviously any message we can send to potential terrorists out there, whether it's in a law or any type of statement, I think is real important. But I think right now, the federal government steps in when there's an act of terrorism, and I honestly, I think the laws are in place to prosecute, at least in our case in Boston, where we had 4 young people killed, and the federal government handled that, and ultimately he was given the death penalty.
Right, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record a letter dated April 18th asking that we, in a classified setting, be able to view the 28-minute video made by Mark A. Condit, the so-called Austin bomber.
No, without objection, so ordered.
And I just want to thank Chief Manley's team for their great and committed work, and hope they understand that people were terrorized. And I do believe there needs to be a federal domestic terrorism crime because there seems to be a distinction in who's terrorizing people and who is not. And I thank Chief Evans, and I thank the chief representing the national chiefs because of the work that you all do, Chief Newsham, and I look forward to working with you on some of these issues dealing with gun violence. I yield back.
And let me just briefly comment. I think we all agree this is a terrorizing event. As the gentle lady knows, being on Judiciary Committee, domestic terrorism is a legal definition, not a federal charge. And I think that is something that if I could finish, I've tasked the Congressional Review Service to study this issue as to whether that would be a good idea, and also have had discussions with federal law enforcement on that issue as well. So with that, Chair now recognizes—
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The Captain Higgins from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chief Manley, Commissioner Evans, Chief Newsham, thank you for your representation of the Thin Blue Line and your service to your communities and our nation. I have a question that's never really been clarified for me, Commissioner, regarding the Boston bombings. When the second Sarna brother was taken into custody, my understanding is the Obama administration directed your boots on the ground to not Mirandize that subject. How was that communicated and by whom? How did it get to the field where the arrest was made?
Well, again, I was out on the street. You know, we were searching house to house, and you know, I remember my pager going off. I remember almost everything that day, and I looked at my pager, and that came right across my pager. And you know, I've never ever had a circumstance in my career where it says, if you catch this individual, do not Mirandize them.
And how did you react to that? Because that strikes me as very odd.
Again, you know, I was out in the street. Obviously, I'm sure it came from Washington down to, you know, the local FBI
When you say
office.
it came from Washington, I don't mean to interrupt you, Commissioner, but just to clarify, from
I would say
DOJ,
from the DOJ, that was sent down to the local SAC of the FBI, who then broadcast it to Commissioner Davis, who then passed it along on the field.
Can you clarify for the committee what public safety exception it exactly was referred to? Was there a statute referred to?
Well, I think there's always exigency should the country be at risk of something of this nature, very much like what we do every day, and whether we need justification to go into someone's house and get a warrant, or go into a supermarket and when there's a gun hidden somewhere. There's always an exception on exigency, and I think this was a prime example. Our country had to find out, if we got this individual, how many more suspects were out there. So I think this was an exigency very much like Austin, that if we caught the individual, we have to find out, no matter what, how big this plot was.
Well, I concur that gentleman should have been subject to extensive interrogation, but it always struck me as odd that to deny Miranda would perhaps be a poison pill for the case file as it moved forward. That order ended up being revoked. How was that revoked? By what means was it revoked?
Well, I think once he was in custody and he was in the hospital and he was being guided by the Boston Police Department and the FBI, that I think his lawyers went to the federal judge, and I think through that the decision was given from here on in he will be Mirandized.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. I'm still not quite clear on how and why that happened.
Again, never seen it in my career.
Neither have I. And the Sarnas created these IEDs allegedly from the radicalized Islamic terrorist publication Inspire, but the level of sophistication of their weapons was beyond Inspire instructions. Was it ever determined clearly by what means they came to learn to use remote detonating capabilities?
I don't think it ever was finally determined. I think obviously we always monitor Inspire, and as their tactics change, we obviously adjust, whether it's you know, car bombs or you know, different tactics, and so. But to get to your question, I don't think we ever really realized where they got the knowledge to build a bomb like that.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I wasn't going to broach this subject, but since it's been presented to you as a panel and before this committee, Commissioner, I'll begin with you because you answered the question. What exactly do you mean by comprehensive universal background checks? How would that manifest to the citizens that we serve within the parameters of the Constitution that we represent?
Well, again, I always say, with all due respect, I think, you know, when we have tough gun laws, I think it makes a difference. I look at certain cities.
I heard that, but I'm specifically asking, and I ask so respectfully, sir, how exactly would so-called comprehensive universal background checks manifest in the United States of America?
Unfortunately,
within the parameters of our Constitution.
Right. I look at it, I go to a lot of homicide scenes, and I see the carnage, and I see the young mothers grieving, and I see so many guns on the street, and sometimes in the hands of people who have no right to have the gun.
You've made that clear, sir. But I ask again, perhaps another member of the panel, if the chairman will allow, in what way would so-called comprehensive universal background checks manifest within the parameters of the Constitution that we serve in these United States of America?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there are any constitutional prohibitions against universal background checks.
How would it manifest, sir? You're talking about the exchange of firearms. What about inherited firearms? What about gifted firearms? What about pre-1968, pre-serial number firearms?
Right. And
how would the exchange of these weapons involve a so-called comprehensive universal background check?
I can say collectively that the major city chiefs believes that far too many firearms are getting in the hands of people who...
This has been stated several times, but my question has not been answered.
And I think that, but I think your question was answered respectfully, sir, that there does not appear to be any constitutional prohibitions against universal background checks that I am aware of.
But how would that... Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I'd like to submit a question in writing to the panel members and perhaps receive an answer back in a timely manner. I yield.
The question in writing will be submitted to the witnesses. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Dibbings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and Chiefs and Commissioner. Thank you for your service, and thank you for the service of the men and women that you command every day. We are glad you are here, and let me just say this, and thank you for your common sense answers to the question about background checks. I spent 27 years at the Orlando Police Department. I had the honor of serving as the chief of police, and as we talk about information sharing, I do remember coming on in 1984, a time when we did not have the capability through technology, but more important than that, we didn't really have the desire much to communicate between with our federal and state partners. But we now know 9/11 changed everything. And I share your sentiments in terms of my interaction on the ground with the men and women of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other federal agencies. When I think about some major incidents and scenes that we've been involved in, there is no way that we could have effectively handled those scenes without our federal partners. So things have definitely gotten better. I know we have talked quite a bit about federal funding. Coming from Orlando, and certainly you know our history, federal funding is real critical to me. And I would like for you, yet again, to, for the record, talk about how important federal funding is to your agency dealing, or how important it was in dealing with the threats that you've already faced and the potential threats that you and your men and women face every day. Chief Manley, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I don't know that I can emphasize enough the importance of the federal dollars to allow us to do what we do, both in a training and in an equipment area. You can't have game day be the first time you're trying to do an operation, you're trying to work with your partners, both local, state, and federal. You can't have that be your first occurrence. We were fortunate enough to use grant dollars to host an Urban Shield exercise in Austin years ago that really showed both the strengths of the system that we had in place, but it also identified areas where we needed to make improvements. And if we don't have the money available to us to allow us to conduct those kind of training exercises, then there are communities across this country that are not as safe as they should be because they've not yet had to practice for that worst day scenario. I mentioned earlier that we used the UASI dollars that we received to fund our ARIC, our Austin Regional Intelligence Center. Without those dollars, I don't know that we would have been able to put together enough money to put that center together. And sitting here today, I know of things, of incidents and events that were stopped because of the work that we were able to do with our federal partners, as well as through our intelligence center, identifying something that was imminent. So I know my community is safer because of the investment in federal dollars. Most of those were coming through the UASI. We're left now to deal with the grant money that comes through the state Homeland Security program, which we're grateful to have, but it has to support a 10-county region, and so we're just one entity within that. So that's why I would encourage, to whatever extent possible, that UASI be fully funded so that partnering and recognized agencies are able to utilize dollars from that program to make our community safer across this country.
Thank you. Commissioner Evans?
I think I spoke to it before, like the chief, about the whole idea of being able to fund URC and, our fusion center. We've been able to hire people to work it through the federal funds. Obviously, to do an urban shield, I think that, like I said before, was so instrumental in how we responded to the Boston Marathon bombing. We continually train on it. We continually, every marathon, use funds from the federal government to do these tabletop exercises. We're able to also train high-level leadership down in Monterey through the Post-Naval Graduate School, which is a great program. I went through it. I know Superintendent Leiden went through it. There's so many good things. There's the equipment we get that our budgets sometime will not support. So whether it's technology, whether it's regular equipment, whether it's training, whether, I can't speak enough for it. And it troubles me that we're thinking of cutting back on this, because I think part of our success is always about being preemptive, not reactive. And that's what Homeland Security does. It gives us the tools to prevent tragedies before they happen.
Chief Newsham?
Yes, ma'am. And I don't know if you remember, but I think we met at the candlelight vigil last year.
We did.
And I want to say that I want to thank you for coming. That's an event we hold every year in the district during Police Week to recognize men and women who've lost their lives in law enforcement, and we appreciate your support on that. With regards to the Homeland Security money, it's really important in that it can level the playing field for major cities. There are cities that are in varying degrees of economic strength, and to the extent that major cities can tap into that money, it really levels the playing field. When you're making very difficult budget decisions as a leader in a police agency, that's one of the ones that stays as a priority. But you also have local crime fighting that's pretty close with that priority. So to the extent that that money is available, it's critical for us so we can receive the training and the equipment that we need to make our cities across the country safer.
Thank you so much. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me just comment. In our reauthorization bill, we nearly doubled the president's request. And I also want to thank the gentlelady for her amendment on the active shooter grant program of $39 million to include former UIC cities such as Austin, Texas, and Orlando. And I look forward to working with you and my police chief. I know that DHS is now reviewing its risk assessment to determine the current UIC cities. And so anyway, thanks for bringing up the question. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Sheriff Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot has been discussed here today about UIC and collection of intelligence and data that is out in the field. I think when you look at cases like Lee Malvo and John Mohammed, clearly there were opportunities missed around the country because of information that was in databases that really wasn't being shared or analyzed. And so UIC was, I think, very important, that funding and being able to bring agencies together. But I would also point out, and I know Commissioner, you and the Chief are, in fact, from LINKS regions, Law Enforcement Network Exchange, and NCIS, the Naval Criminal Intelligence Service, when they partnered with Northrop Grumman to come into these regions and build these information sharing systems, was a tremendous benefit all across the country. There's now 14 of them. And that is how most fusion centers are actually being fed the data that they're analyzing. So my point is this. I would like to ask for the International Association of Chiefs of Police and others to assist. I just spoke with Appropriations to put the LINKS program, the funding within NCIS, into the appropriations budget as a line item so that we can continue the good work that's being done there in bringing this data together. But not only bringing the data together, because part of what we also need is the analytics. You reveal what, look, like I've told folks, the problem in law enforcement, Mr. Chairman, is not that we don't have the data. The problem is we have so much data. And the trick is, how do you use these analytical tools to dip into that huge stream of data and then get out just what you need. And so what I'm curious about is if you would support that kind of funding stream also from NCIS to continue the LINKS programs. Anyone?
Absolutely. I mean, it's such a tool for us on this. And, you know, obviously we have analysts, a lot of them right out of college who are pretty sharp kids, and the ability to keep them and the ability to hire more obviously is always a challenge for us. But, you know, I'm 100% behind. I mean, it's clear we don't have enough analysts to get through all the data, but clearly it helps us tremendously.
And I would agree with the Commissioner. I believe the worst position we can put ourselves in is having the information but not having done something with it, because then we have not kept our community safe. And I think we all recognize the challenges and the shortcomings we have, and often it is resource-based. You said it best, we've got the information, we've got a lot of information, and we've got a lot of talented individuals in police departments across this country that are skilled analysts, whether they're coming from private sector or coming from the military, but we will never have enough analysts because the work that they do allows us to put the officers where they need to be so they will have the greatest impact. It allows us to identify not only what's happening in our communities, but also in the realm of predictive policing and where I think policing is going. The investments in those programs are imperative. And so if there are more dollars that could be moved into that area, it would be very appropriate.
Thank you.
Yeah, and the only thing I would add too is, you know, the conversation that you just had with us is similar to the conversations that's been going on at major city chiefs about the volume of data and then the need not to miss something, and that requires folks who have the expertise and analytics to be able to draw from that data to come up with you know, usable information for law enforcement executives.
Thank you, and I would say, Mr. Chairman, that the capability of dealing with that mega data is certainly something that UASI could really help with, and I know whether you're a tier 1 city or a tier 2 city in UASI, you know, I think some of the challenges that we had with UASI in the first rollout, you know, we had. Everybody thought they needed a tier 1 bomb team. Everybody thought they needed a tier 1 SWAT team, when we don't. And what we really should have done, I think from the federal standpoint, was forced a regional approach. And so I look forward to going back around on that and maybe rolling UASI back out with a regional approach that makes a lot of sense and gets us the best bang for our buck. So. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his experience that you bring to the committee. I also want to recognize my Tomball Fire Chief, Randy Parr, who is here with us today. Randy, thanks so much for being here. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Berrigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your service and for your testimony here today. I just want to reiterate how important I think the Homeland grant funding is. We heard your testimony today, just to reiterate how important it is for you to prepare in the event there is an incident so that you can properly respond. And so I think it's great to have you come in and testify about that today so that Congress can continue to not just fully fund it, but to look for opportunities to increase as opposed to reduce those grant opportunities so that we can continue the interoperable emergency communications. And I won't even ask what cuts will do, because I think you've kind of testified to that. I also want to thank you for your response on the universal background check. You know, the reality is that gun violence in America, as you mentioned, is ongoing. It's a problem that we have to address. And to see a panel unanimously talk about the need for universal background checks is refreshing, because this is a topic that even in Congress we just can't get a floor debate on these things, and so it's very frustrating sometimes, especially as a new freshman member who comes here and wants to have debate on these issues. With that said, you are tasked with protecting and serving our community, and know in recent years also there have been a lot of more high-profile mass shootings across the country, and they have been involving these assault-style weapons. And my question for you is, how does the availability of these weapons make your job to protect and serve your communities more difficult, and what would be your suggestions to keep these types of weapons out of the hands of those who shouldn't have them?
You know, I don't, I've said this several times before, that assault weapons were designed specifically for killing human beings in a warfare situation, and there's no need to have assault weapons in our communities at all. The ability to you know, destroy human life and on a large scale with these weapons is unbelievable. You know, we have to train with these weapons because there is the real possibility that there could be an offender that has one of these weapons that comes in to do harm. So we have a pretty good understanding of the capacity of these weapons to inflict harm on large numbers of people in a very quick amount of time. I don't see any reason to have them in our community in any way, shape, or form. I don't see any good reason to have these weapons in our community.
Thank you. Mr. Evans?
And I agree 100%. I think I spoke before about how many young kids are killed in our cities, not only in Boston, but across the country. And whether it's AR-15s or these semi-automatic handguns, there's no place for those in a city, really, especially in the hands of young kids who don't know the danger that they cause. And in Massachusetts, we're fortunate, again, we have an assault rifle, you know, ban on having those, and also we just ban bump stock. So we're very good about you know, getting tough on these. And I reckon back to the whole idea that we're the safest state in the country because we're so tight on the guns. And you know, there's one thing that keeps me awake at night, and it's getting a call of a young child or a young adult being killed by violence on our streets. And sometimes, whether it's Parkland or it's these big shootings, but every day in our cities across America, we have young African Americans, young kids getting killed, and it's almost like we accept it. We shouldn't, and I think it's all because we have so many guns in this country. So I'm a big advocate of way too many guns, not too many laws, and I think Massachusetts leads the charge.
Well, thank you. Mr. Manley?
And the prevalence of weapons, I will agree, is problematic across the country. Assault weapons like this are problematic because of the high capacity and the ability to inflict harm on much larger groups, and you don't need an assault weapon for home protection. There are other ways that you can keep your home safe, your community safe, yourself safe. And so I don't see the need, and then especially when they're so easily modified to be fully automatic and make them that much more deadly, or with what we saw in Las Vegas, the ability to use bump stock technology, again, making them capable of firing at just an incredible rate and taking a large loss of life.
Well, thank you. I'm going to just quickly here. You made a comment, I believe it was Mr. Manley, that there was no link in the Austin bombings to terrorism or hate, and you know, the victims were people of color. How is that not a link at all?
So the first three involved victims of color, the first two being African American, the third one was a Hispanic female. The fourth bomb was placed in a residential neighborhood of Austin, where two Anglo males were actually the victims of that bomb. And then the fifth and sixth bombs were bombs that were mailed, and they were not mailed to members of the minority community as well. So what we really have right now, barring something that comes out of the additional analysis that is still going on, is we have victims that were selected at random. We cannot link the bomber to the addresses where the first three packages were left. And so whether we will at some point through analysis or not, I don't know. So initially, after the first three, we were recognizing publicly that although we had no reason or information or evidence to show that it was, we could not rule that out yet. And to this point, I will tell you, we still can't, because we're still conducting the investigation.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because what we're seeing, what it appears to be, is that when there's violent acts by people of color, it's treated as terrorism, while it's being perpetrated by a non-person of color, it's not. And so thank you for clarifying that. I think this is a larger conversation I hope we can have one day. Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields, and I want to thank the witnesses for your valuable testimony. I want to close with, personal story. I've often said it's time now to heal for the Austin community and for the victims. And I spoke with one of the victims' families, and she told me a moving story of healing from Esperanza Herrera, or Hope as they call her. The third Austin bomb in the series of attacks injured Hope when she picked up a package outside of her 95-year-old mother's house. And 2 weeks later, Hope had forgiven the bomber, which is incredible, and believes that God's hand was involved with her survival. Hope recalls that the last name of the ATF Victim Services official who came to her house, her last name was Faith. And the homicide criminal investigator, his officer, as you know, Chief Manley, his name was Officer Love. She took that as a sign to help her heal faith, hope, and love. And as we all heal and the successful investigation winds down, I think we must remember the tremendous job at the federal, state, and local law enforcement level, and you, sir, Police Chief Manley, as our fearless leader with the entire nation watching. With that, we're going to take a quick break and bring back the second panel. We're pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. Our second panel includes Mr. Kerry Sleeper, the Assistant Director for Partnership and Engagement at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and Mr. James McDermott, the Assistant Director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. I want to thank both of you for being here today. Your full statements will appear in the record. Chair now recognizes Assistant Director Sleeper for his testimony.
Your microphone.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Watson Coleman, other members of the committee, it is my privilege to appear before you today as the Assistant Director of the FBI for the Office of Partner Engagement. We welcome this opportunity to meet regarding the status of the FBI's information sharing initiatives within the FBI and with our local law enforcement partners. The Office of Partner Engagement implements initiatives and strategies which support engagement, communication, coordination, and cooperation efforts with law enforcement, intelligence, public and private agencies, and partners in a continuous effort to enhance the FBI's capabilities in the domestic information sharing architecture. I would like to begin my prepared remarks by affirming the FBI's continued commitment to ensuring threat information is shared accurately and timely among our valued federal, state, local, tribal, and territorial law enforcement partners. As we are all aware, the devastating attacks at the 2013 Boston Marathon highlighted challenges and deficiencies in information sharing. In response, the FBI, working with this committee and several of our oversight committees, as well as the national level law enforcement associations, such as the major city chiefs who were in here just moments ago, took several steps to enhance information sharing with our state and local partners, to include regular FBI executive meetings with our key partners, improvements to JTTF processes and procedures for information sharing, and enhancements to the eGuardian program, which today facilitates the reporting and sharing of terrorism, criminal, cyber events, and suspicious activities by our law enforcement partners. Shortly after the attacks in Boston, the FBI witnessed a significant increase in the threat from ISIS and its affiliates, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations. The threat from international terrorism became more diversified and individualized as lone actors self-radicalize in the homeland. This shift required the FBI to evaluate more closely the effectiveness of terrorism information sharing with our local law enforcement partners. In doing this, the FBI undertook several initiatives to improve engagement and collaboration. In coordination with the National Fusion Center Association and other federal partners, the FBI developed the Enhanced Engagement Initiative, or EEI. The EEI is a resource designed to provide field offices, FBI field offices and fusion centers with a common set of recommendations to ensure greater continuity and standardization of terrorism information sharing efforts. By focusing on key areas of engagement, such as JTTF participation and coordination, suspicious activity reporting, and intelligence analysis, production, and dissemination, the EEI supports the FBI in its efforts to ensure that fusion centers have a complete understanding of the terrorism threat and are appropriately leveraged with other field-based information sharing partners to address the ever-changing threat landscape. In support of the EEI, the FBI has developed and delivers a 2-week analytic writing for Fusion Center Analyst course, which provides training on the intelligence process and writing to intelligence community standards. At the request of the NFCA, the Fusion Center, the FBI has also provided greater guidance to its Fusion Center partners on the FBI's most commonly shared products and how they should be further disseminated, as well as joint guidance to state and local partners regarding actions they may expect from FBI and DHS in response to specific and credible threats or incidents. In coordination with the Major City Chiefs Association, the FBI is developing a process to aid police departments in identifying and prioritizing threats within their areas of responsibility, with the ability to then compare their findings with departments across other jurisdictions. From the above, it is clear that the FBI is more integrated with its law enforcement partners than ever before on the terrorism threat. Moreover, coordination with our federal partners is much stronger and more collaborative. The FBI and DHS regularly hold joint conference calls with our law enforcement partners as terrorism and other critical incidents unfold. These calls are generally at the unclassified level, but may be classified depending on the nature of the event. These calls enable the FBI and DHS to provide timely, but more importantly, accurate information to our partners who seek a consistent message from their federal partners. For example, following the recent attacks in Austin, Texas, the Austin Chief of Police, with support from special agents in charge of the FBI and ATF offices, hosted a conference call to provide in-depth details regarding the investigation and ongoing efforts. Several thousand law enforcement personnel, utilizing over 300 phone lines, participated in the call to gain insight into the attackers' methods and tactics, and to discuss how resources can be deployed in support of these events. 5 years after the tragic attacks in Boston, we are witnessing a shift in the threat landscape. While we remain intently focused on counterterrorism efforts, law enforcement departments and agencies across the country are facing an unprecedented increase in a multitude of threats. Violent crime, mass casualties, and school violence are prevalent, while nation-state adversaries are becoming bolder in their efforts to sow discord within our communities. The volume and variety of these threats require state, local, and federal law enforcement and Homeland Security personnel understand the threats, openly discuss and share information on the threats, and identify means to collectively mitigate the threats. In conclusion, the FBI today is sharing more information with its law enforcement partners than ever before. Our partnerships are strong and must continue to grow. This occurs through daily interactions and direct support to interagency initiatives, such as the FBI hosting the upcoming 2018 Intelligence Summit, which is intended to further improve information sharing practices with our law enforcement partners. We are assessing where the FBI can do better, and we're making changes. One significant example is the ongoing Guardian expansion project, which will enable the FBI to manage tips and complaints across all program areas with a single intake system for suspicious activity reporting, tips, leads, and other information received by the FBI, to include information received through the FBI's public access line. Despite this, the FBI and its law enforcement partners still face challenges that are difficult to overcome and therefore limit our ability to fully identify, collect, and share information. The going dark problem is preventing law enforcement who have a legal authority from obtaining critical evidence in support of criminal and national security investigations. The dark web is enabling illicit and criminal activities that are far more difficult to dismantle. The FBI is providing dark web familiarization training to local law enforcement partners to provide familiarity on the methods and tools used to conduct these investigations against actors utilizing dark web, but more is needed. This concludes my remarks, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you, Director Sleeper. Let me just comment on the going dark issue. This committee issued a report on that problem, and I recognize it from a law enforcement standpoint, and I stand committed to working with you to resolve it. Chair now recognizes Assistant Director McDermott.
Chairman McCall, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the ways the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives shares threat information and intelligence with its federal, state, and local law enforcement partners. I am honored to be here today with FBI Assistant Director Carrie Sleeper, a leader in promoting information sharing and coordination among law enforcement. Before discussing the important subject of information sharing, on behalf of Deputy Director Brandon and all the men and women of ATF, I extend deeply felt condolences to the families, friends, and loved ones of those who were killed or injured during the recent bombings in Austin, Texas. The senseless Austin bombings are another terrible and compelling reminder of the need for ATF to maintain unrelenting vigilance in our mission to identify and combat criminals who use firearms, explosives, and fire to commit violent crimes. ATF's core mission includes preventing the criminal diversion and misuse of explosives and the investigation of arson and criminal bombing incidents. A central aspect of this mission is providing support to our law enforcement and public safety partners who also respond to and investigate bombing and arson incidents. We do this through training, research and development, and leveraging expertise and technology, and importantly, providing access to timely, accurate information. In 2004, then Attorney General Ashcroft directed the consolidation of all Department of Justice arson and explosive incident databases into a single system, known today as ATF's Bomb Arson Tracking System, and that it be administered by the United States Bomb Data Center. BATS is a web-based case management system which provides federal, state, and local arson and explosive investigators access to up-to-date arson and explosive investigative data from across the nation. While I have focused much of my written statement for the record to the committee on ATF's capacity to share information and support investigations involving arson and explosives, I would also like to describe briefly ATF's broader commitment to the development and sharing of intelligence and information, particularly with respect to violent criminals and criminal organizations such as gangs. Throughout our existence, ATF has pioneered ways of providing law enforcement community with timely access to intelligence about violent criminals. For example, in 1994, ATF established the Violent Gangs and Terrorist Organization File, known as VIGTOF, within the National Crime Information Center system known as NCIC. The VIGTOF file provides secure access to NCIC users to intelligence information about violent gangs and their membership. To enhance ready access to ATF's information and intelligence data, in 2006, we established and continue to maintain an information portal on the Regional Information System, Sharing System known as RISNet, a congressionally funded program consisting of over 9,000 law enforcement member agencies with 130,000 authorized users, seamless, secure access to our BATS database, E-Trace firearms tracking system, and our GangNet intelligence database. In addition, ATF provides open and closed investigative case data from our case management system to the FBI's National Data Exchange known as NDEX. NDEX is a national information sharing system that enables criminal justice agencies to share, link, analyze, and share local, state, tribal, and federal records. Lastly, ATF posts intelligence products in the form of bulletins, alerts, advisories, and general intelligence information on the Homeland Security Information Network known as HISN. The ultimate successes in Boston and Austin bombing investigations reinforced a principle ATF has long recognized. Building and maintaining established partnerships based on trust and mutual respect is essential to effective information sharing in both daily, routine interactions and when critical incidents occur. As a result of our deep-rooted daily working relationships with federal, state, and local law enforcement organizations, formal and informal information sharing is a daily occurrence for ATF, and we continue to focus on strengthening those relationships to enhance further communication of the critical information needed to keep our community safe. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you again for this opportunity to discuss with you the importance of law enforcement information sharing. We look forward to working with this committee and members of Congress to better serve and protect our nation. I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Director McDermott. And let me just say at the outset, I think, while maybe too often members of Congress are critical, and while we do have an oversight responsibility, I just want to personally thank both the FBI and the ATF for a job well done in my hometown of Austin. I met with members of ATF locally. I went by the local field office of the FBI to say thank you and present a flag and meet the agents. And I won't describe the one who provided the critical analysis on this case, but just very impressive work. And I just want to say, as a resident of Austin, thank you for what you did.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you. You know, in the whole Boston hearings, it was not ever, and I always said this, was not intended as a gotcha exercise, but rather, how can we learn? You know, as with anything, there's a post-mortem, lessons learned. We can learn from any event like that to see how we can do a better job. And I commend the FBI for making progress since the Boston bombings in several key areas that I think made a difference when it came to Austin. And I want to go through some of these, and then Director Sleeper allow you to comment, and Director McDermott. As you know, this committee made several recommendations in its report, many of which were adopted. I think the most critical was the amended language on the MOUs with locals to emphasize that information sharing is encouraged, not discouraged, particularly in the Boston case, the police chief, commissioner, not having access to the information that his people in his police department did. Senior leaders pledged to communicate the value of information sharing. They conducted regular briefings, expanded access to classified Guardian system and unclassified Guardian, and expanded access to other FBI databases. That's a big step forward with federal, state, and local. And then finally, DHS made changes to how records of travelers reviewed by customs personnel, which was a case in the problem in the Boston case, to enhance those systems, and make sure that CBP and JTTF officers pass that information to the JTTF case agents electronically rather than writing down on Post-it notes, which is what happened, as you know, in the Boston case. So if you wouldn't mind commenting on that, but I also just want to, not only was the federal, state, and local partnership exemplary in the Austin model, but I think also between the federal agencies. I heard nothing but how FBI and ATF worked so well together, and that hasn't historically always been the case, either at state and local level or between federal law enforcement agencies. So I want to commend you for that, and Director Sleeper, would you like to comment on the progress that the FBI has made?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. As I said in my opening testimony, the FBI recognized the deficiencies in information sharing post-Boston, and the appropriate changes, working closely with our partners, mutual changes were agreed upon and made. It wasn't just the changes in information sharing processes, procedures, MOUs. It went well beyond that. There was a cultural shift, not only in the federal government, not only in the FBI, but our state and local partners, recognizing we're facing a diversified threat now, far more diversified than ever. And we can't effectively address that in the law enforcement community unless we're working shoulder to shoulder. Those 1,000 state and local officers that are in our JTTFs are shoulder to shoulder with our agents. Director Ray frequently cites examples of him going into field offices and being briefed by the JTTFs, and it's actually a state and local officer, a unit supervisor that's briefing him. So we've come a long ways. We'll continue to obviously drive that integration because the threat demands it. The public demands that we're as responsible as possible. But certainly this committee assisted us post-Boston in understanding and appreciating where we needed to go with our partners, so we appreciate your support in that process.
And thank you, and thank you for mentioning the culture change. We recommended that, but we can't legislate that. But I had personally, as a former federal prosecutor, both before and after 9/11, and now today, have really seen the change, and it's really one for the better. And I think the FBI was very wise to hire you, sir, as a local sheriff in Vermont to be in the position you're in today.
A trooper, sir, but thank you.
Director McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say that we have all made great strides since 9/11 to better keep each other informed. But I would say that, as an organization, ATF is one that prides itself on partnerships and relationships. And it's through those relationships, particularly during a critical incident, wherein the information is not yet in any one database that we've made available to our partners. But it's through those relationships that the trust is built, which enables that free flow of information. I think is the chief of Austin indicated. In his case, all of those initials were left at the door, and that's what's important. But again, we're an agency that works day in and day out with our partners. We cannot complete our mission without those partnerships, And again, it's through those partnerships that the trust is built so that when a critical incident presents itself, those barriers no longer exist.
That's, I like the phrase the chief used, and yourself leaving the titles at the door. So that chair now recognizes Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you very much, and let me thank you both for your service, and let me just say that I'm a proud American, and I'm proud of your organizations and the professionalism that is displayed by all of your employees. I have some questions, and I really want to just focus a little bit on what happened in Parkland as an illustration of how we failed to recognize that there were instances of see something, say something, and tips, but we weren't able to really do what we needed to do to preclude that horrible situation. When the FBI receives a call to the tip hotline, what is the process for responding to that, to evaluating it or addressing the tip? Who actually gets that call? Specifically, what were the gaps that resulted in the failure to address the reported tips about Nicholas Cruz, who subsequently carried out this tragic shooting in Parkland? And what has the FBI done to prevent this from reoccurring?
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
First, let me state very clearly, as the director and the deputy director have said, the FBI could have and should have done more to further investigate the tip that.
I appreciate that. I just want to know. I want to know what happened.
So there's an ongoing internal investigation on that, Representative, now. We would be able to fill you in more completely once that investigation is completed. What I can tell you is there was immediate remedial action taken to address the initially observed deficiency, that is the failure to understand the threat completely and communicate it into an information sharing system. But the details on it, due to the internal investigation, Representative, I'd like to wait until that is completed, and we will get back to you with the details on that.
So let me just ask you this, actually through the chairman. Would the information that you need to share with me that I'm interested in, specifically answer to these questions, would that need to be done in a classified setting?
No, it would not be.
Okay. So then I am going to ask that we do have a very detailed response to each aspect of this question that I've put forth here today. And not to criticize, but to understand what in the system didn't work and what are we doing about it now that should ensure that something of this nature with so much scuttlebutt going on around this individual not happen again.
Representative, the FBI wants to provide complete transparency on this process. We just need to wait until this internal process is completed.
How long do you think that's going to be?
I will find out for you, Representative, and get back to you.
Thank you so much. It is my understanding that after the Boston bombing, the FBI sent out a directive to the field requiring increased information sharing between the FBI, the federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. What did that directive require? Does the FBI still follow that directive today? And what other initiatives or measures has the FBI implemented since Boston to promote information sharing on Homeland Security threats? What more remains to be done? I can repeat every one of those questions to you one by one if you want.
Representative, there have been a number of steps that continue to today. And let me start with today. Christopher Coombs, the SAC from Austin, who was working with the chief, is briefing all of our special agents in charge of the FBI today at our SAC conference across the city. He's briefing them on how information sharing should work and did work and the best practices. So continuously reinforcing to our leaders in the field how critical and how important it is. Getting back to immediately post-Boston, this committee, major city chiefs, the FBI, and a number of our partners convened a series of meetings on what would be effective for the FBI in order to improve information sharing. All of those recommendations were taken into consideration, each and every one of them, and all of them have been implemented in the sense of task force officers having complete access to information, task force officers being expected to look at all threat information for their AOR, not just the case they're working on, but all threat information in their AOR. The closing of cases and guardian leads, of conveying that information to state and local partners upon closure of the investigation, determine if there is a continuing public safety concern on those individuals that we can't legally pursue any longer because of DIOG guidelines, but that individual still may be a public safety concern to the community. Additional training of officers, a series of ongoing steps occurred, and I would like to think that's why the chiefs that were here and the other chiefs that we work with literally on a daily basis are saying that information between the FBI and their state and local partners is flowing very effectively. Where we do observe an issue, that's generally dealt with at the local field level and dealt with very quickly.
Thank you. I just have one last, okay. This has to do with information gaps as well. And I'm particularly focused on what needs to be done to ensure that everyone that needs to be feeding into this information sharing process is doing so. And I'm reminded of the Sutherland Springs, Texas shooter, who really, because of his personal history, should not have been permitted to purchase a gun. Are you aware of anything that your office is doing or ATF is doing that working with our armed forces who has a responsibility to put this information someplace so that it is available when a person of this ilk that they know about shouldn't have a gun is able to purchase the gun? And I don't know if that's for you, Mr. Desmond. I think I need glasses that are stronger than the ones I'm wearing. I'm having a hard time today seeing, Mr. McDermott, I'm sorry. Having a hard time today focusing on distance. Thank you. I don't know if that's the question that I needed to ask you. I need to know what's happening on a federal level, talking to another partner here, which would be the armed forces, that has a responsibility to feed information into some kind of system where it should, so that we would know that the person who committed that horrible crime at the church and killed all of those innocent people would not have had access to a gun, the purchase of a gun, if his information were where it should have been. And if you can't answer it, you could tell me you will look into it and answer it. But it's a very important question.
Congressman Watson Coleman, I can say that both the ATF and NFBI are working with the Department of Defense to improve the input of military records. This is part of the Attorney General's coordination to ensure that those records will now be placed into the NICS system.
Okay. Anything you need to add to that, Mr. Sleeper?
Representative, what we're seeing as a result of the latest incidents, just as post 9/11 and Boston was a challenge in information sharing in the sense of taking foreign intelligence and bringing it in domestically and sharing it with our state and local partners. What we're seeing as a result of the latest incidents, we're finding that there is information, there is threat information that's siloed in non-traditional partner information sharing groups. It's a complex issue. It's not going to be resolved easily. It needs to be done thoughtfully, but we need to recognize that many of the individuals that are committing these acts are known to law enforcement, they're known to the mental health community, they're known to the social services community, and they're known to the education community as well. And all of those communities make some type of an assessment. Those individuals could be a risk or a threat, but seldom is that information integrated into a specific threat assessment on those individuals.
And
That's
it
where I
should be,
see our
right?
challenge
Yeah.
in moving towards.
And who would be the logical entity to sort of be the keeper of that information and the disseminator of it when necessary?
We're just in the infancy of that discussion. I heard the chiefs have a discussion with the Attorney General about a month ago, and this was the single issue regarding the threats to schools that was most alarming, in the sense that many of these individuals have, for the lack of a better term, come upon our radar previously. Some have been in treatment, some passed through treatment, some have been in jail, come out of jail. How do we collectively, from a broad government perspective, share this information
Yeah, we
appropriately?
need to collect it and have it someplace where it's easily
Appropriately.
retrievable and accountable.
Those
Yeah, bingo.
discussions are beginning to take place.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sleeper. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being with us today. Director Sleeper, back to Ms. Watson-Coleman's original question about the tip line and the Parkland shooting. I certainly understand that you have an active investigation going on, and we certainly would not want to compromise that in any way, just like we would not want to compromise any investigation that is going on. But if tips started coming into your hotline this very moment, have steps been taken to prevent whatever went wrong in the Parkland shooting with those tips, to prevent it from the same thing from happening again?
Yes, they have.
Can you talk somewhat about that? What steps you have taken?
Immediate steps involved a complete review of previous tips coming in to determine there was no hanging threat out there. Additional personnel have been assigned to the project to add an additional layer of supervision on decisions that are being made, so additional staff. The size and volume of the tips, the PAL line, the public access line, is quite remarkable. Over 700,000 tips a year by phone, over 700,000 tips a year electronically. So about 1.5 million tips a year coming into that facility between phones and emails. Again, a rapid evaluation by FBI executives and leadership to first immediately identify any deficiencies that the deficiencies that were observed were mitigated, and those have been mitigated, Representative.
Great, thank you so much. And I know that your Bureau works very closely on a regular basis with local law enforcement. In your testimony, you mentioned that in response to school shootings like Parkland, that you are engaging more proactively with law enforcement. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
The discussion, again, with all of the associations, and the FBI will be hosting a school safety symposium in June sometime here in D.C. to bring together the partners and coalesce what we in the law enforcement community can do to strengthen or prevent violence in our schools as much as we can. The discussions are focusing around what can we do? What can we do more effectively in identifying behaviors and indicators that are likely to allow us to identify those most likely to commit an act of violence? What tools do we currently have that we can mitigate that threat? Non-traditional tools. It may not rise to a level, that threat may not rise to the level of some type of criminal prosecution, but might we be able to leverage resources at the community level, such as community mental health, crisis interventions that could take that individual at risk and hopefully off-ramp them so that they don't commit an act. In the future, longer-term discussions on how we can work with school resource officers, hardening of schools, and what we may be able to do. Yesterday, I met with Max Schachter. Tragically, his son was lost in Parkland. We had a significant discussion on what he and other people may be able to do to strengthen school safety and harden schools.
Thank you, Director McDermott. Could you talk a little bit about your, I believe it's the ITIP line, and your interaction and coordination with local law enforcement as well, particularly as it pertains to school shootings?
Yes, Congresswoman. With respect to our ITIP line, that is, as a result of the Parkland incident, we took a look ourselves at how we handle tips coming into ATF. They come in through the traditional ways, tip lines, email, as well as text. And since Parkland, we have taken additional steps to introduce new technology through our ITIP. It's an app that can assist us in better managing those tips as they're received, triaged, and then acted upon. So if the tips are something that falls within our mission lane, more often than not, we're notifying our local partners anyway because we cannot complete our mission without that support. So they're aware of the tip really at the same time we are. If it's something that's outside our scope, our responsibility, we ensure that that information is immediately passed to the agency that has jurisdiction in that area. With respect to school shootings, we're working very closely with the department on the initiatives that the Attorney General has announced or did announce in March. But with respect to what we're doing today, it's working with our partners in bringing our resources to bear to look at these types of incidents and what we can do to try to prevent them in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Generally yields back. I just had two quick follow-ups. Director Sleeper, on the MOUs and the recommendations, have the new MOUs been signed with all the JTTFs across the nation?
No, sir, they haven't all been signed simply because the difficulty in the thousands of MOUs that are out there, and actually some agencies preferring not to sign MOUs. We've gone beyond the MOUs, Chairman. I believe the MOU is intended to immediately address the concerns or the deficiencies that were observed. I believe we're light years beyond those initial recommendations. And I'm comfortable in speaking to my state and local partners that they concur with that.
Well, and clearly the previous panel agrees with you. And the Guardian leads, I think one of the frustrations was the case closed mentality. That, well, that case was closed, and even if there's new evidence, like the fact he went to Dagestan and back, would not reopen it. And I commend you for sharing that with the state and locals, because I understand the DOJ guidelines as a former federal and you're you're constrained by that. But if you can share it with state and locals, they can maybe provide a further investigation and more eyes and ears on a potential suspect. And so that's a very good change moving forward. And then I'll just end with on the gun issue. I used to prosecute gun cases, and the NICS, National Institute Check System, it's only as good as the information that's in it. And I'm glad that we were able to pass the fixed NICS bill in the omnibus, which will hopefully get more of this data shared and put into the system so we don't have people falling through the cracks like we've seen so many times previously. And I know also that your agency, sir, is looking at the bump stock issue and reviewing that. I think we're pretty much all in agreement that what happened in Vegas turned a legal firearm into an illegal firearm. So with that, I want to thank the witnesses for being here. The record will be held open for 10 days according to committee rules, and the committee now stands adjourned.